Welcome in, everyone. This is Sean with MTG 808 Jr. Got a white-black Reanimator list for standard Artisan, for Duskmourn standard, that I want to share with everybody today. I think this has a lot of powerful tools. It's a fun kind of archetype to play. Get to do really powerful things, and I think it has the tools to be really competitive in the standard Artisan metagame, so I want to share it with you guys today. Before I do that, though, I want to plug our Patreon. MTG 808 Jr. is on Patreon. We do use basically all of the money we have some operational costs, but the vast majority of the money that we take in from our Patreon goes towards supporting youth magic, so especially our annual scholarship tournament that we run in Hawaii, and we are in the works of potentially starting to branch out to other locations, start running a couple more scholarship tournaments, or at least one more for now, scholarship tournament outside of Hawaii, trying to branch out, grow the youth scene in other places to work towards our dream of bringing back the Junior Super Series from long ago. But our patron, we've got a bunch of different tiers that you can support us at. All of our tiers get access to our yearly expense report, so you can see how we're spending the money, where we're putting our resources, how we're planning on growing, and of course, if you become anybody really who has a vested interest in seeing youth magic grow, we would love your feedback. But especially if you become a patron, we would love to hear any feedback on what you would like to see the project grow into. So check out the Patreon if you want to support us, and a big thank you to Koji, Joe, James, and Corey, who are our current patrons, and big thank you to them and all of our previous patrons from years gone by. We would not be able to do what we do without you, so big ups to that. So back to black-white Reanimator, or Orzhov, as some people like to say. So this archetype was really enabled by the Duskmourn set. The black-white archetype in draft is Reanimate, which is not usually a very well-supported archetype in draft. It's usually kind of like something that you can do every once in a while, but it's not like a focus. But uniquely in this set, Reanimate became a focus. So Reanimate just means that you use spells to get creatures from your graveyard, put them directly into play, ideally a big fat creature that costs way more than you're paying for the Reanimate spell, so you're kind of like cheating creatures into play. Shroud Stomper is the really big one here. It costs 7 mana, 3 white, black for a 5/5 Death Touch Elemental, and when it enters or attacks, each opponent loses 2, and you gain 2 and draw a card. So it comes in, you drain them, you draw a card. Even if they kill it, you still got that value. You still gained a little bit of life to help you take the game long. This deck it has a lot of really powerful cards in it, so this deck wants to take the game long. It wants to hit lots of its land drops. Sometimes you do end up just hard casting Shroud Stomper and the other big fat threats that we're going to be looking at here in a minute. But Shroud Stomper is really like the cornerstone of the deck. It's usually Reanimate targets are like rare or better. But this one is uncommon, it's legal in standard Artisan, and it is definitely worth cheating into play. So Shroud Stomper, the ways that we're going to cheat into play, the really sweet way is push-pull. So this is a split card with hybrid mana. Hybrid mana just means you can use either of the colors in that mana symbol to pay that color requirement. So push is 1 and a black-white hybrid mana. For a sorcery, destroy target tapped creature. It is a sorcery. It does have a restriction, so basically the creature is going to get at least 1 attack in before you can target it with push. But in a pinch, if you absolutely need to get something dead, push will do it. Ideally, though, you want to be holding this card in your hand to be able to cast pull, because pull gives you a real big burst of damage and card advantage potentially when you cast it. So pull is 4 black-red hybrid for a sorcery. Put up to 2 target creature cards from a single graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. They gain haste until end of turn. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. So they don't stay in play, but they do gain haste, so you get to attack with them right away. So you get like a big sudden burst of damage. And if you target 2 Shroud Stompers, they're going to come in. Each of them are going to drain for 2, and you gain 2. So that's, you're draining for 4 and gaining 4 when the 2 enter play. You're going to draw 2 cards when they enter play, and then since they have haste, you get to attack with both of them, and you get to their attack trigger right away. So you're going to gain 4, your opponent loses 4, and you draw 2 more cards right away. So that's, what is that? You're attacking with 2 5/5, so that's 10, and then you're draining them for 8. So you can potentially deal 18 damage on turn 6 if your opponent has no interaction or way to block. Even if they do and they're not just dead on that turn, you're drawing 4 cards. So you're gonna you get a really big burst of advantage here if you are able to pull off that sequence. So push pull. There are a number of other reanimate targets, most of which have sweet enter the battlefield effects as well. So if you pull back most creatures in this deck, you're going to get some sort of enter the battlefield trigger to get that advantage from. So pull is really sweet. And then the other one here, one of the key cards from Duskmourn that just got printed for the archetype, Rite of the Moth. 1 white, black, black, so 4 mana. For a sorcery, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. So it stays in play, but it has that finality counter, which means that if it goes to your graveyard from the battlefield, it gets exiled instead, so you can't reanimate it multiple times. But there are enough reanimate targets in the deck that even if one target gets exiled, you should still be able to use future copies of Rite of the Moth. Or if you just have a single copy, because Rite of the Moth does have flashback. Flashback costs 3 white, white, black, and you can cast it again from your graveyard. So there are a bunch of mill effects in the deck, so even if you mill it, you can get value from this with the flashback. So just these 3 are kind of like the cornerstone of the deck. They allow the deck to kind of like, the longer the game goes, the more places you're going to have to put your mana, and the more likely it is that you're going to be able to just overpower your opponent the longer the game goes. So a couple other top-end targets that we have here in the deck, because you need to make sure that you have a target for these cards. You can only play 4 Shroud Stompers. You need to have a couple of other second string targets, we'll call them. So Wix Patrol, 4 black black for a 5/3 Rat Warlock. When it enters, you mill 3 cards. When you do, target creature and opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the greatest mana value among cards in your graveyard. So we do play a lot of expensive cards, notably Push Pull. When it's in your graveyard and you're checking mana, it does count the combined mana, so this would count for 8. But we have a lot of expensive cards in the deck. You should be able to kill their biggest thing with a Wix Patrol. And it does just have that enter the battlefield trigger. If you pull it, you're completely fine. Getting in an attack for 5, getting the enter the battlefield trigger. If you Rite of the Moth it, you get to kill something right away. And then even if you exile it with the finality counter, you're perfectly happy. And it does notably mill yourself, so it does help you find future copies of targets for future copies of Rite of the Moth and Push Pull. So really, really good fit for the deck. Got 2 land cyclers in here. So Spectral Snatcher, 4 black black for a 6/5 Spirit. It has Ward, discard a card. That just means if your opponent wants to target it, they have to discard a card, or that spell or ability that is targeting it gets countered. And then you can Swamp Cycle it for 2. So Swamp Cycling is you pay 2, discard it, search your deck for a swamp, put it into your hand. And notably, the cost of Swamp Cycling is discarding this card. It's in your graveyard. You can target it with Push Pull or Rite of the Moth. It's not the most, it doesn't have an enter the battlefield effect. It's just a big body with stats. But the deck wants to have lots of mana sources. But this is kind of like sometimes a mana source when you need it, and then sometimes a reanimation target if you need it. Sometimes you're just going to hard cast this. So it does a lot of things that the deck wants to do. None of them especially well, but since it does so many different things that the deck wants to do, it's worth having a flex thought there. Same thing with Soaring Sandwing. This is just the plain cycling version of it. 4 white white for a 3/5 dinosaur with flying. When it enters, you gain 3 life, and it has plain cycling, so you can search for a plains if you pay 2 and discard it. That's kind of just like our flex spot. If you're in a pinch, you can discard them, get that body in your graveyard, reanimate it. And also, we are playing Descend cards, so the permanents in your graveyard matter. So this is a 4 casting cost target that it's not ideal to reanimate this, but since it has a good enter the battlefield effect, like just reanimating it and reusing triggers on it is perfectly fine. But it does have a Descend requirement, which checks how many permanents you have in your graveyard. So the Swamp Cycler and Plain Cycler can just go straight to the graveyard to count for this. So Chupacabra Echo, 2 black for a 3/2 Beast Horror Spirit with Fathomless Descent. When it Chupacabra Echo enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So there are a lot of mill effects in the deck. We already looked at the one with the Wix Patrol, but we have lands that can go to the graveyard early. We have a bunch of mill effects. We have a bunch of discard effects. So if you play this just on 4 and you had like a reasonable hand leading up to it, you should be able to kill something with at least 2 toughness, maybe even 3 toughness, depending on, you know, what you've milled or how lucky you've gotten with the mills. So this is like a reasonable thing to play on 4. It has that enter the battlefield effect, so it's worth getting back with your reanimation effects. And it just checks, you know, it's a powerful effect as long as you're able to turn on the Descend, which this deck should be able to do. So those are kind of like the good targets that you want to be getting back with your reanimation spells. The rest of the deck is kind of like enabling that, because, you know, if you have a Rite of the Moth in your hand but you don't have a creature card in your graveyard, it's like you just mulligan because you have a dead card in your hand. So you need to be playing effects that are going to get those cards into your graveyard. So one of the ways to do that is by straight up discarding it. Split Skin Doll. We've looked at this in previous videos. It is 1 and a white for a 2/1 artifact creature toy. When it enters, you draw a card, then discard a card unless you control another creature with power 2 or less. So this deck weirdly sometimes wants to discard a card, even if you don't have to. So sometimes the sequencing with this might be weird. You might not want to play your Gnawing Vermin on turn 1 to make sure you can discard the Shroud Stomper that's sitting in your hand on turn 2 with Split Skin Doll. So that's just something to be mindful of. Sometimes you are just going to be perfectly happy drawing a card off of this and not discarding, kind of like in the mid to late game. But in the early game especially, you should be mindful of your sequencing to make sure that you can discard a card to this if you want to. And then the other card that allows us to discard if we want to is Bitter Triumph. 1 and a black for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you either discard a card or pay 3 life, and then you can destroy target creature or planeswalker. So almost every other deck would just play Go for the Throat or Shoot the Sheriff or Fell, or, you know, one of those spot removal spells in this spot that doesn't have an additional cost. But this deck sometimes does actively want to discard a card, right? If Shroud Stomper is in your opening hand, you don't want to wait until turn 7 to play this card if you have a Rite of the Moth or a Push-Pull in your hand. So discarding it early, even if you don't have to, you may want to, discarding it early is very beneficial. So we have those 7 cards that allow us to discard straight from our hand, and then we have another 7 cards here that do mill us early. So Desperate Bloodseeker, 1 and a black for a 2/2 lifelink vampire. When it enters, target player mills 2 cards, almost always going to be targeting yourself. Same with Deathcat Marionette, 1 and a black for a 1/1 Death Touch. When it enters, you may mill 2 cards. So I could see it being correct to play 4 copies of one or the other of these. Deathcat Marionette is better against bigger creatures. Desperate Bloodseeker is a better clock, and the life gain is sometimes important. So, you know, feel free to make changes to this deck as you see fit, but I'm just playing a split because I don't know which one is better as the metagame stands. Could see those numbers being played with. And then the other mill card we have is Gnawing Vermin, 1 black for a 1/1 rat. When it enters, target player mills 2 cards. Again, you're going to almost always be targeting yourself. And when it dies, target creature you don't control gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So you can kill 2 creatures. Excuse me. You can kill 2 creatures that have 1 toughness, right? You block one that has 1 toughness, they trade, this dies, and then you give -1/-1 to another creature with 1 toughness. If your opponent's board sets you up for that, then that's sweet. Otherwise, this can trade with a 2 toughness creature, right? You block a 2 toughness creature, Gnawing Vermin deals 1 damage to it, the trigger gives it -1/-1, and then it dies as a state-based effect. So those are 7 cards that mill you early, 7 cards that allow you to discard early, and then we've got the 2 land cyclers that can go to the graveyard early. So you should be able to have enough permanents in your graveyard to turn on Chupacabra. You should be able to get enough sweet targets for your reanimate spells. And then just the the longer the game goes, your deck is full of expensive, powerful creatures, so you should be able to close the game out as long as you're not dying in the early game. Last non-land card that we're going to look at here in the main deck is Scrapwork Rager. This is kind of another one of those flex spots. It is a 4-mana artifact creature for a 2/2 Phyrexian Horror. When it enters, you draw a card and you lose 2 life, and then it has Unearth for 3 and a black. So Unearth means if it's in your graveyard, you can pay the Unearth cost. I think is it cast? No, it's just a triggered ability. So it goes straight into your graveyard, and then it gains haste, and then if it leaves the battlefield for any reason, after it's unearthed, then it gets exiled, and you would sacrifice it at the end of your turn. So essentially you're going to get 2 triggers off of this. You can just play it on turn 4 to draw a card, kind of, keep the gas flowing for you to get to the late game, or if you mill it, you can unearth it and just get value that way. So it might not be worth playing it in the main deck, but those are like the 3 flex slots here, the Planecyclers and the Scrapwork Rager, that I see to just kind of like play with the general game plan. The lands here, we're playing 25 lands with the 2 land cyclers. Like I said, this deck has so many big, powerful, expensive cards, you will sometimes just end up hard casting your reanimation targets. So you want to like not miss your first 7 or 8 land drops in the deck. So we're playing 25 lands, 2 land cyclers. Notably, we are playing 6 tap lands. You may notice that the deck doesn't have any 3-drops, so you will have a lot of sequences where you'll find a spot to play a tap land and still like spend your mana for that turn. But we've got a split here between Scoured Barrens, dual land that enters tapped, but you gain a life, help you take the game a little longer, and then Escape Tunnel. It just is a dual land. You find the color that you need, you tap, sack it, find the color that you need, and then notably it is in the graveyard to count towards Fathomless Descent for Chupacabra Echo. It does have the added bonus ability that you can sack in and target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. I would be very surprised if that came up very often, but you never know. If your opponent's at 2 and you have a Split Skin Doll and you need to kill them, this will do the trick. So that's it for the main deck. Sideboard is kind of a hodgepodge. 4 dead weights. We've seen cheap removal in the sideboard of almost every deck that I've featured on our deck techs. Gotta respect the aggro decks, especially that Red Prowess deck. I think that is going to be a beast in the metagame. Notably, we are playing Deadweight instead of Disfigure because it counts towards Fathomless Descent for the Chupacabra Echo. Losing instant speed is a cost, but you do also just get the bonus of if you're playing this on something with more than 2 toughness, it does shrink it permanently. So it is all just a trade-off. Soul Guide Lantern. All right, this is one of those decks that the other decks are sideboarding Soul Guide Lantern for. This is not the only deck that relies heavily on the graveyard, but so having a Soul Guide Lantern in the sideboard just gives you a little bit of game there. Nettle Guard. This is a creature that allows you to destroy artifacts and enchantments. So if your opponent, the Meticulous Excavation deck in the mono white deck, or the Auras in the Aura deck, if they have like a key important enchantment or an artifact and you want to get rid of it, Nettle Guard will do that. And then you can also, because it's a creature, you can get it back with Rite of the Moth or with Push Pull. So it's a 1 white 3/1 Mouse Soldier. Valiant doesn't really matter in this deck, but whenever it becomes target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, it gets +0/+2 until end of turn. Again, not going to come up with this deck, but you can pay 1, sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. So 3 Nettle Guards. We are playing 1 more Scrapwork Rager in the sideboard for the, if you're playing against another control deck and you just need to side in some card advantage, Scrapwork Rager helps you play the long game. Another card that is good in the long game is Another Chance. 2 and a black for an instant. You may mill 2 cards, then return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand. So if you're just playing the long game and you need to grind, this not only mills early, but it lets you get back creatures from your graveyard to just recast the good old-fashioned way. We'll feature... So in keeping with that vein of if you're expecting the game to go long, like you're playing against another endgame deck, Dire Sight is another card that is a good tool there. 2 and a black for a sorcery, Surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. So the Surveil 2 is important here. Gets cards into your graveyard for the Echo. If you want to mill a reanimation target, it allows you to do that, but then you also draw 2 cards. So if the losing 2 life isn't super relevant in the matchup, but you're going to be fighting over drawing more cards than your opponent, this is a great card to have. And then the last card that's kind of against those type of decks that are good is Defiled Crypt and Cadaver Lab. So it's a room. You can play the Defiled Crypt half for 3 and a black. And then it says whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, create a 2/2 black horror enchantment creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So if you pull it back with Rite of the Moth, if you pull it back with Push-Pull, or if your opponent like Soul Guide Lanterns you, this will trigger, giving you a little extra value, and then you can unlock the Cadaver Lab side for 1 black, and then you just raise dead something back, a creature from your graveyard to your hand, which will then trigger the Defiled Crypt. So this is just, again, that's kind of like the group of cards that you would bring in against decks that are going to take the game long, because Gnawing Vermin and Deathcat Marionette are not super great there, so you want to be able to take those cards out and bring in cards that are going to be better in the long game. Rounding out the sideboard here, I've got 1 copy of Consumed by Greed. Your graveyard is going to be full if your opponent is playing big fat creatures. This is, 1 black for an instant, gift a card, which means you let your opponent draw a card, and then target opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures you control. If the gift was promised, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So you don't have to give them the card, but if you do, you get to get a creature back from your graveyard and put it in your hand. And then the last card here, neutralize the guards. 2 and a black for an instant. Creatures target opponent controls get -1/-1 until end of turn, and you Surveil 2. So for those go wide token decks, this is kind of like your trump card. And having the Surveil 2 tacked onto it lets you keep fueling your graveyard while interacting with their board. So that is the deck in a nutshell. There's lots of flex spots in this deck, so if you do pick it up, think about those flex slots and play around with them however you see fit, especially the sideboard. I've got a lot of one-ofs just because there's a lot of different cards that fill the niche that I want to fill of like having more long game. There's lots of cards that fill that niche in slightly different ways, so if you like one more than another, feel free to tweak with it. If you play the deck, let me know what you think. Would love to hear any feedback on your thoughts, and thank you if you've stuck around this long to get to the end of the video. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Every click, comment helps us out, get into the algorithms, grow the channel, which would then allow us to have supplemental funding for the youth project. So any and all support is welcome and greatly accepted. So thank you all for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed the deck. Let us know what you think, and I'll catch you next time. Peace and chicken grease.